start by saying, by chance there's a fire alarm, despite the fact that it's April Fool's Day, we have to take it seriously. So we will move. And if people could turn off their ringers, that would be appreciated. We're very honored to have this morning Under Secretary of the Army Brad Carson. He has spent, I believe you're just past your 1-year anniversary as Under Secretary, but he was well familiar with all the issues he'd be taking responsibility for when he came to the job, having come to it from being the General Counsel for the Army, and has a very diverse and interesting background prior to coming to the Department of the Army, having worked with the Army downrange as a naval intel officer with an EOD battalion in Iraq, having thought about military issues in general when he served as a representative of Oklahoma's 2nd District in the House of Representatives in the early 2000s. He's a lawyer by training, along with being a Rhodes Scholar. He's been a law professor. He's been a practicing lawyer, both in the private sector and, as I mentioned, for the Army, and is now both the Chief Management Officer for the Army. Is that official?
Not official. I think that statutory. They talk about the unders serving that role.
And in general, the Secretary's number 2 guy on all things Army. So it's a particularly interesting time to be in the position. And we're very much looking forward to your thoughts on where the Army's headed, and given the topic of the day, innovation, how it's thinking about innovation and your sense of the kinds of things the Army ought to be innovating about. And so we will get to that shortly. I also just want to quickly note that for those of you who are either watching on the web or who are in the audience and don't want to, who are shy about raising their hand when it comes to question time. Oh, it's not on. Okay, it's better. I'm not very technical. People can email questions to me at mlead@csis.org, so mleed@csis.org if you choose to go that route. Otherwise, people can raise their hands, wait for the mic. Please identify yourself and be brief. It would be appreciated. So Secretary Carson will make a few remarks, and then we'll open it up to have a broader conversation. So again, sir, thanks for coming. We appreciate it. I have to also say that we've been begging him to come for, it seems like ages, so we're thrilled that it finally worked out. And I'm afraid, because it's April Fool's Day, that you might actually run off the stage. But I think it's real, and we're very happy to have you. So, sir, over to you.
Well, no, thanks, Dr. Lead. Thank you all for coming today. It's great to be here at CSIS. I'm an avid consumer of your products and the wisdom you have about the things I care deeply about and work in now. So a pleasure for me to be here. I do feel like I should be paying tuition to the audience rather than having me talk, because I said just the people I know here in the front rows. We have retired general officers, former undersecretaries of the Army, Woody, who knows the Army better than probably all of us combined, having been around and caring for the institution for such a long time. I know we have fellows here who are active Army officers and people from other services too. So thank you. And I can say, having been in the office now a year, I have learned tremendously from many of the people I just called out, and from the junior officers who have made me much smarter by coming to my office as well. What I thought I might talk about today is innovation in the larger sense of that. And you know, this is the anniversary, this very month, the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And whenever I go to Barnes & Noble's, there is a spate of books out about the Civil War to celebrate this momentous occasion. And they will often have on the cover a picture that, even though a fairly recent vintage, has become almost iconic. And it is called The Surrender, and it is Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee, of course, looking regal as history remembers him to be. Grant looking more assembled than his personal life would otherwise suggest to us he probably was. 14 other people appear in the portrait who, by all accounts, weren't actually there, but played some role in the day's events. An important portrait, and it again speaks to the end of that conflict. There's another portrait, though, that I've always admired more about the Civil War. It was painted contemporaneously really with the events it depicts by George Healey in 1868. And it's called The Peacemakers. And it shows sitting around not much different than Maren and I are here, William Tecumseh Sherman, Ulysses S. Grant, now forgotten to history, David Poynter, a rear admiral, and President Abraham Lincoln. And it occurred 1 month before the Appomattox Courthouse. And the event, which Sherman recounts in his memoirs, was to discuss the last few weeks of the war, as well as, most importantly, plan about what the months, the years after this conflict ended, and how it would play out. That portrait, not that well known, of those 4 men hangs now in the tank where the Joint Chiefs meet to decide weighty issues. It has become famous over time because a version of it is in the White House. George W. Bush referred to it as something that meant a lot to him after September 11th. And I'm now told it hangs in the private dining room of President Obama, the Peacemakers. I think of that because we are now, although re-engaged in Iraq, in the Army thinking a lot about what the Army will be as we leave now 14 years of hard conflict. Conflict that all the services have played a major role in, but no one more so than the U.S. Army that has fought and bled. And when you go to Section 60, Arlington National Cemetery, you'll see a lot of Army soldiers there. We have sacrificed so very much. So we think about what the future is going to be. And if the chief were here today, he would say that is deeply on his mind in the last few months of his tenure. We have initiatives that are publicized to those who care about defense matters, such as Force 2025 and beyond. We have a new Army operating concept. If General McMaster hasn't been on this very stage, he's much easier to get a hold of than me, actually. He is a terrific salesman. And not only a salesman, he's the product development. It is from his mind that many of these ideas about the future really spring, and he is an awesome spokesman for how the Army is thinking about these things. I thought I would talk about how I think about it, and think in terms of how those 4 men who are in that George Healey portrait must have thought about it. Because you know, with just a little bit of imaginative sympathy, you must think that they were awed by the 4 years that had preceded them. They could never have imagined how the world would change so dramatically. A U.S. Army that at the beginning was engaged in infrastructure projects for the United States, constabulary operations, coastal defense, where people were called up to fight at Manassas, and senators and congressmen and their wives would go watch on the hills nearby, called up for just a few weeks. Said by the end of this, with railroads and telegraph and the proliferation of rifles, mass industrial warfare that previewed the conflicts that we would see over the next 50 and 70 years in World War I, World War II, the war between Russia and Japan, the Boer War, the Franco-Prussian War. You know, the fact that Sherman himself, right, who became not simply a pioneer of tactics, but right, almost a person who embodies the idea of total war that the 20th century came to refine in such a bloody fashion. You'd think they must have really been awed at the transformations that they had seen. The Army finds itself similarly today in a position where it is easy to be awed by the world we confront. You know, the new slogan for the Army is "Win in a Complex World." General David Perkins, the 4-star general, who is in charge of training and doctrine command, we'll talk a lot about this issue, and I think it is a fascinating thing. It is easy to be arrogant and think that we are in some unique time, that the world is changing underneath us more so than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. It is easy to be arrogant, but it does seem as if there is something afoot. This revolution in communications that allows the world to act in simultaneous fashion now, that is something that is truly new. Small autonomous groups that once had a collective action problem that they couldn't formally to get together and work and surmount the obstacles of coordination, now use information technology to do just that. There are real changes afoot where, not that long ago, just a couple 100 years ago, war was led by men who fought with individual weapons, sometimes leading from the front themselves, offering leadership more by moral example than any kind of like tactical or strategic expertise. Said is now fought not simply by systems, but systems of systems. They require greater and greater specialization from all of the services. In World War II, there were just a few dozen MOSs across all of the services. Today, there are hundreds of MOSs. We have specialties of specialties of subspecialties. All of these require technical expertise. They demand of commanders to know more and more. The information flows are therefore greater. The ability to create some form of knowledge or wisdom out of that data becomes an incredible intellectual challenge that is solved only by having rules of thumb, heuristics that allow you to kind of put these in some place, which are essential, but if in error, can lead to terrible, even tragic decisions. The Army is confronting a new world where we not only have a revanchist Russia, a rising China, of course, ISIL, Yemen in flames. We have non-state actors that are expanding their capabilities, access to technology that was once unthinkable. At the same time that globalization has taken real root, we see a return to primitive identity formation that attacks the nation state from below, just as globalization attacks it from above. This is the world the Army finds itself in and tries to adapt itself to. So for me, I would say there are three challenges that might be worth mentioning today. One is material, the second is managerial, and the third, for lack of a better term, is metaphysical. The material one is obvious to all. The Army has a budget this year of about $120 billion. That's a lot of money. Not as much as the Navy and the Air Force are getting, but more than any other cabinet agency, with the exception of Veterans Affairs. The Army is still a big place. And then you have $20 billion in OCO funds to add to that. A lot of money, but far less than we thought just a few years ago, where the anticipated budget for this fiscal year was expected to be $150 billion. So over the last few years, we have found in our planning processes about a $30 billion cut for us to make. As a result, there are real consequences, mostly in what we think of as materiel. The modernization, the research and development programs for the Army, right, don't have near enough funds for them. Over the next 5 years, we'll spend maybe $120 billion on modernization. The major drivers of that being aviation, being the network, air and missile defense, vehicles. But there's not enough to do all of these kinds of things. They're very expensive programs. And we have a challenge in thinking through how we prioritize among them, how we move into new programs that don't threaten to consume the entire budget. If we want a future fighting vehicle, for example, how you reconcile the cost of that with the other programs for the Abrams and the Strykers, not to mention other parts of the acquisition portfolio. So there's a real material problem in that respect. There's a managerial issue as well. My challenge, and I think Secretary McHugh and the Chief's challenge, they say too, is to create an institutional Army commensurate with the operational force. The operational force is great at planning. They move out and do things. The tactical acumen, the leadership of people in the field is incredible. The headquarters, by contrast, is not nearly as agile. It is not just arthritic, but so sclerotic at times, right, that blood is barely reaching the various appendages of the bureaucracy. And so how you get things done, how you make decisions, how you push things through as a leader rather than simply react to matters that rise up to you from the Council of Colonels and the 1-star general officer meetings, the 2-star general officer meetings, the 3-star general officer meetings, by which time anything interesting has often been rounded off of the PowerPoint slides, and you're left with nothing to do but acquiesce in decisions that present no real alternatives to you. So how do you manage the Army in a better way? We've tried to do that. Part of it is by slimming down the headquarters. The Army took very seriously what Secretary Hagel ordered us to do. So the headquarters has been reduced by more than 20% and will be executed over the next 4 or 5 years to do that. And we haven't just gone through and demanded people make arbitrary cuts. We have tried to reduce the number of echelons. There were, in the headquarters, there are often 9 echelons between the chief and the secretary and the lowest level people. Sometimes you had SESs, or senior executives, people who are the equivalent of general officers at echelons 6 or 7, very far down in the organization where you wouldn't think a leader of that stature would otherwise be. We had spans of control, people who were managing 1 or 2 or 3 people, when Army regulations contemplates managing 10 to 12 at a minimum, and best practices in the corporate sector suggest 6 to 8. We have changed that to where now everyone in the headquarters, with a few exceptions, manages at least 8 people. We had people reporting to others of the exact same grade. GS-15s reporting to GS-15s, reported to GS-15s, or colonels to colonels to colonels. Things that put the entire planning of careers and information transmission on hold. And therefore, it is a belief of mine, and it comports with research from the business community, that every echelon a message is transmitted, you lose perhaps 10 or 15% of its fidelity. So you could imagine sending a message down to echelon 9 and having it chopped all the way back up, right? The noise to signal gets way out of balance, and so managing the Army in a better way. We've instituted the Army Management Action Group, the Army analog to what Bob Work runs, the Deputy Secretary, the Deputies Management Action Group, where the Vice and I chair, and we try to have meetings about the really important decisions. The Army Plan, 60 years. It has existed. It was read by few, although people in the G357 and the G8 and others spent, man-years upon man-years creating it. Right, we've completely revamped that, doing an Army vision, which will be released in the next few weeks, trying to make strategic planning as vigorous at the headquarters as it is in our subordinate commands and out in the field. Real strategic planning, not simply one-to-end lists or like a discussion of the important questions, but a plan that deals with the real obstacles we face. These are the managerial challenges of how you put your imprint on the Army as a senior leader. And lastly, I said metaphysical, by which I mean the Army is in one of its periodic identity crises. This happens after every major war, when people seem to turn away from the need for land power, where the consequences of these conflicts make people say, we will never do this again, whether it's after World War II or Korea or Vietnam, and now after Iraq as well. And the consequences are very real. We see that. Right? I mean, the VA, their budget I mentioned has grown larger than the Army's, but that's really a recent development. Over the last decade, you've seen the VA budget explode. And we will be feeling these wars for not just years, but decades to come. We're still paying, after all, widow's benefits to a survivor from the U.S. Civil War. And given the way lifespans are increasing, there is every reason to doubt that not only my son will see people who receive these benefits, but my son's son's son, well into the next century, will have people who exist around him, right, who are receiving some benefit that flows from the consequences of Iraq and Afghanistan. But the Army is trying to figure out where it goes. That is why I mentioned General McMaster's great work, General Perkins' great work in the Army operating concept. What is the Army? What is our role? If the country believes that the Pacific Theater is the future, what's the Army's place in it? What traditions do we revitalize? What lessons do we learn from Iraq and Afghanistan that we want to make sure we don't forget, as some would say we forgot after Vietnam? How do we institutionally change? How do we become more innovative? How do we become agile and adaptive? What do those terms really mean, to be agile? That's a great term. One doesn't want to be not agile. Yes, I accept that. What does it really mean in terms of what we program and how we think about these things? To ask those kind of tough questions is what we're doing. And trying to also convince a nation that is no doubt fatigued by a decade and a half of these conflicts that land power is going to be really essential. Because in the end, the Army has a singular competitive advantage. No other service has this, which is we can make you change your mind when you otherwise don't want to. Other services can perhaps have offshore presence and do aviation, bomb you, and perhaps make you change your mind, persuade you that the costs of this outweighed the benefits. But the Army can kick in your door and make you stop doing what you want to do when you'd otherwise like to continue. And we can do that in a sustained, massive way. And there is no other service that can do that. All the services have a unique advantage, but that's the Army's. And that is a capability no great power would want to be without. And we have to do a great job of explaining that. And let me conclude with this about trying to explain ourselves better. And this has resonance for me, and it is street fighting math, not exact math, so one can try to reconcile it later. But oftentimes I'll talk, for example, to my father, who's a veteran of the 1st Infantry Division, and we'll say we have 500,000 people, more or less, in the active component of the Army. It's a lot, right? Larger than nearly every army in the world, with the exception of a couple. So that seems like a large amount of people to have. So why can't you get by with 400 or 300, or as some people in think tanks have said, a 250,000 person U.S. Army in the active component? And I always say, it does seem like a lot, but those of you who know how the Army really works, the numbers are not quite as significant as they seem. Because of that 500,000, we have 70,000 who are in the generating force, who are manning, training, and equipping. We have another 80,000 or so who are trainees, transients, hospitalizers, students. There's 150,000 who are right off the table. We have 30,000 in special forces doing their own kind of missions. We have another, let's say, 30 or 40,000 doing other important national missions, Patriot batteries, THAAD batteries, the Old Guard, these kind of things. So now you're down to maybe, let's say, 300,000 people. Well, if you're going to rotate these folks through, which we believe we have to do for both effectiveness and out of basic humanity, if we're going to do a 2-to-1 ratio in the active component, that's 100,000 people that we can put into combat today, while the other 200,000 are back home, training, getting ready to go. Well, at our peak in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had 183,000 soldiers deployed. So that 100,000 doesn't even get us to where we were. Now, there are ways to manipulate that. People can be in it to win it, and we can manipulate the so-called, what we call the boots on ground to dwell ratio, what OSD now calls the deploy to dwell ratio, D2, right? Everything is an acronym or shortened. So the D2 ratio, right, there are ways to do this, and of course, the reserve component plays a key role to help augment our capabilities too. But it's a way to think about how rapidly we can consume U.S. Army forces. Now, even a 500,000 person force, which is, yes, that is a lot of people in the active component, right? But we use them, and it can go very quickly. So those are the great challenges I see for us going forward. A tumultuous time for the Army, both inside, as we think about ourselves, confronting a world that does seem to have had some kind of step change in the last 30 years to a new place, and how the Army deals with it, how this country deals with it, is something that we grapple with. So,
thank you. That was a massive amount of information. So I very much appreciate the scale and scope of your comments. And I know there are lots of questions out there, so we will get to those in just one moment. I want to exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask you something you didn't talk a lot about your specific role. So it's a two-part question about your specific role as the Undersecretary, a position which has a lot of latitude, has been interpreted very differently by many of your predecessors, and varies across the departments, arguably, despite having the same sort of statutory guidance. And so I wanted to ask you about what you see as your primary responsibilities and priorities as the Under, and then ask you more generally about, Senator McCain was here last week talking about his desire to relook Goldwater Nichols, and there seems now to be a growing consensus that some of that ought to be relooked, and I believe numerous service chiefs have talked about their views on some of the things that ought to be changed. So I wanted to get your perspective on whether, either within the context of Goldwater Nichols or otherwise, you think we have the balance of secretariat versus the rest of the enterprise responsibilities, roles and responsibilities about right? And then same question for within the Department of the Army specifically. So.
Well, the role of the Under is what you make of it, or what your principles let you make of it. In some way, it's like being the vice president. You could be, as John Nance Gardner once said, it's worth nothing more than a warm bucket of spit, when he was not giving any responsibility by President Franklin Roosevelt. Or you could be, as it has been in recent years, where you have people like Al Gore and Dick Cheney who exercise tremendous influence. So I see my job as making the secretary and the chief able to make better decisions. That's not codified in any general order or in the statutes, but that's my job, is to allow them to make better decisions by assimilating information, by pushing back, by ensuring the presentations accurately reflect the real choices, that dissent within the Army staff or the Secretariat is noted, that they fully understand all the implications of this. They get to make the decisions, unless they expressly delegate them to the Vice or to me or to others, but to allow them to make better decisions is how I see my role. Of course, I have a statutory role that you alluded to at the outset, where as Chief Management Officer, I'm responsible for these enterprise resource programs and the auditability and the management of it. So this very technical aspect, extremely important aspect, is something that the unders, working on business transformation in the services, by which we mean more or less the rolling out of IT programs to improve our efficacy, is something that I see myself as doing. So I have a great relationship with Secretary McHugh and the Chief, and because of that, they give me a lot of latitude to try to do things that I think are interesting. But I never forget that in the end, the Secretary and the Chief get to make the important decisions. And for me, it's about advocating for certain changes. It's about understanding what they want to do and making sure, as their action arm, that the Army staff or the Secretariat does it. So fixing problems is how I see the role as being. On Goldwater Nichols, I didn't see what Senator McCain had to say about it. So let me take a more agnostic approach, that this is going to be very interesting to watch how Goldwater Nichols plays out. Because we never have seen it, right, in a world really where there wasn't plentiful resources, where service chiefs and others could not kind of get along, right, in divvying up the resources about things. And now we're in a world where, right, the pie has gotten smaller, and the demands are anything greater, right? We don't even have money for the Ohio-class submarine replacement, zero money for that, much less the other billions that the Navy needs for shipbuilding. You know, you have the long-range strike bomber coming online, the KC-46, the F-35. You know, it goes on and on, so resources are scarce, so it's going to be interesting to see whether the comity that has been over the last few years is something that can continue. Is the balance right within the Secretary and the Army staff or the services? You know, I find this to be an environment where it's all about the personalities. Secretary McHugh and the Chief get along very well, and it gets along famously. Right, you have to fight for your prerogatives at all times. You have to fight for your oversight roles. You have to fight to be involved in the action. You have to add real value to it. Because the great thing about the Army, perhaps all the services, but I see the Army, they get things done. You know, these are people who are used to getting things done. They move out, they fix it. You know, they have a plan, they're energetic, they have a bias to optimism. You know, they thought through leadership. And so people get things done. And you have to get with the program because there are projects that have to get done, and someone will do it. And so I think the balance is good, but it's one that I think changes from administration to administration. New people come into any particular job, and we all have, right, exact complements on the Army staff. So I have the Vice, you have the Manpower and Reserve Affairs, and the G1. And that relationship is going to be about the people. But in the end, that's what the Army is about. General Campbell, the former Vice, now in Afghanistan, would tell you, it's all about relationships. And having good relationships allows this very unwieldy beast where you have two parallel organizations, the Secretariat and the Army staff, more or less charged with doing the same thing, right? How this all works and doesn't become just, you know, bureaucratically a nightmare or burdensome is all about the willingness of people to work together and having a strong relationship. When those don't exist, I think things can fall through the cracks, be frayed, tempers rise, but I've seen it work really well. And that's a testament to Secretary McHugh and the Chief and the people they put in these jobs.
Okay, thanks. So audience questions, I've got a couple already by email, so get your hands up quickly or I'm going to turn to these. All right, since I see none, let me ask you one. Can the Army reap the benefits of innovation if it does not improve institutionally its tolerance of failure and thereby encourage risk-taking and real creativity?
No. By definition, to be innovative is to court failure, to be vulnerable, and we have to do that. The more interesting question is, does the Army really not tolerate those kind of things? It comes back operationally. I think operationally, we do tolerate failure. The first thing you'll talk to people in the field, right? This is not a zero defects mentality. People make mistakes, right? There's fog and friction, and perfection is unattainable. And we reward innovation, and I think it exists. Institutionally, it's a little bit harder. And one thing's like in the acquisition realm, especially, and perhaps in like the intellectual realm too, which I'll talk about. But in the acquisition realm, the processes are not, they grind on. So it's not that they don't reward innovation, it's that innovation and new ideas don't naturally arise from it, because there's a risk aversion, not about fear of failure, but everybody wants a piece of it, they want to add their requirement to it. And it's really hard to get that requirements process right. Intellectually, there is incredible ferment in the Army. You read Military Review, you read other things, you read War on the Rocks, you read Small Wars Journal, right? Every major and lieutenant colonel is writing interesting pieces that are at odds often with what the Secretary and the Chief are saying, or what I or the Vice are saying. And that's a great thing. And the Army has this incredible ferment. Do those people stay in the Army? Are they punished for it? I never really see that. The Army is a culture, like all the services are. And so I have no doubt we have certain cultural biases toward things. We work strongly to try to not affirm those. And there's a great culture out there of doing it. So I don't know that well, innovation by definition involves risk-taking and failure. I think the Army's interested in that. And that we do reward it. But how you make it scalable to the U.S. Army, how you, and how those ideas, the good ideas come to the fore, I think is another challenge. But that's not unique to the Army. It's just a bureaucratic problem.
Okay. All right. Okay, we've got one here, and I'll turn to another.
Sir.
Okay. Can you?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, Mr. Undersecretary. Wonderful remarks. I'm Nigel Sutton from AeroVironment. As you're talking about balancing your core missions and then your innovation part that you mentioned, where do you feel industry can help you on this? Where do you feel that we can come to the table? If you called a meeting this evening and said with certain main industry players, what would you ask them right away how to be able to help you? In which areas?
I think you have to help us understand the future better. So from an industry standpoint, you have to help us understand the boundaries of the technically feasible, for example, which has often befuddled the Army in the past, as we had grandiose visions of how technology would develop that didn't come to be realized. So that's one thing you can do. Industry is filled with people like yourself and others who know the Army well, know the service as well. The challenge for the Army, and it goes to this risk-taking question, is we have to make a decision about what the future kind of looks like and plan for that, while realizing that one can't plan for every contingency and be willing to branch off to do something else. That's the great challenge. The question I often ask, and it's kind of a seminal question I ask, is when you say to me, what size should the future fighting vehicle be, 20 tons or 80 tons? How do you adjudicate that question? How do you even begin to wrestle with it? Should protection be on the front, the side, the bottom, the top? How do you adjudicate that question? Well, it presupposes a vision of how future war could look. And that's what one has to grapple with. And that's very hard work, to understand the trends, to maintain flexibility where you're not wedded to one course when it turns out that you were wrong about it. So that's the challenge we have, and industry can help us with that. And the boundaries of technical feasibility are an input to that. But that's what we have to do in the Army. I mean, that's what I spent a lot of time when I speak with HR or Dave Perkins to say, tell me what future war is going to look like. And I can tell you whether I need a 20-ton or an 80-ton, or perhaps a 20 and an 80-ton vehicle, or something in between. Because otherwise, it doesn't help me make the difficult trade-offs. We speak often about lethality, agility, protection, mobility. I'm for all of these things, right? They are all unabashed goods. Unfortunately, they are not always perfectly complementary either, and they are substitutes on the margins. So which do I choose? Lethality or protection or mobility? These are interesting questions. They go to the heart of our enterprise. And when I say we're not good at innovation in the acquisition process, it's because people say we have to have all of these things. When you have all of these things, you have nothing. right? It becomes unusable, this behemoth that proliferates in cost and proves to be unusable. Difficult choices have to be made. And the only way I know to arbitrate those matters is by thinking, like, here's what war is likely to be like in the future. Here's the threats. And here's how we build options within our choices, where we don't become so path dependent, that we are this way and can't go another in 10 years. But that's what industry can help us do. And this is the challenge. If you go to the commercial sector, I was once a business school professor, they famously think quarter to quarter, year to year. In the Army and all the services, we think decade to decade. We're already talking the 2030s, 2040s, and what we're going to be doing in that. The world changes so much. That is an incredible challenge. And though we don't always get it right, should not be surprising given the difficulty of the project. But that's what we're trying to do. And industry can help us do that because you think even more deeply than we do about how the world is developing. What's the technological limits of what we can do? And we try to move there. So that's the things I think the industry can do.
Okay, Ray?
Ray, another former Under Secretary of the Army. How are you, Mr. Dubois?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The membership of the Commission on the Future of the Army was announced in the past week. Certainly the purpose for the Commission is to address the ACRC, and more particularly the active Army versus the Army Guard balance.
Right.
Capabilities, where should they reside, end strength, et cetera. Were you to be called to testify in front of the Commission, how might you address the Army active, Army Guard issues? Number one. Number two, would you also want to suggest to them that they have an opportunity to look at the future of the United States Army, active Guard and Reserve, in the context of both the Army, the Special Operations Forces, and the Marines, the Landpower triad?
We are going to be both eagerly engaged with and waiting with bated breath the report next February of the National Commission, which is not only going to look at the ACRC mix, but a related issue to that, which is our aviation restructuring initiative, and their opinions about that. And I think the Commission is stocked with exactly the right folks who are deeply committed to the total force and understand the active component well, and the reserve component's contributions too. If called to testify myself, I would say what my own experience is as a Navy reservist. As Maren mentioned, I served with the 84th EOD Battalion in Iraq, so an Army unit. I know the role of the reserves. I'm a proud reservist. I don't think of myself as a substitute for an active duty sailor or an active duty Army EOD tech, for example, or EOD intelligence officer, which is what I was. I'm not a substitute for that person. I'm a complement in some ways, and with the right amount of training, perhaps a significant amount of training after mobilized and in the workup year to it, right? I can almost be a substitute for that. So I think what I would tell the Commission is the reserve component is an important operational part of the U.S. Army. That will not change. If anything, going forward in these austere budget times, and having seen the contributions of the reserve component over the last 15 years, the reserve component will grow in importance, not diminish in any way. And they're going to play an incredibly important role in the national security of this country. In many ways, they are not substitutes for active duty BCTs, but complementary to them, and have unique skills that are essential to our success, but are not one-for-one substitutes for them. So that's what I would, I think, tell the Commission if called to testify for that. The reserve component is an unbelievable tradition. The sacrifices that the RC has made is quite incredible. And when I look toward the future and the kind of conflicts we're going to be in, that question I answered a moment ago about what's the fundamental thing we're after, which is we have to envision the future. I cannot envision the future where the reserve component does not play a extraordinarily significant role in Army operations. Because what we're going to be called upon to do, we find in the RC those skills. I mean, think as an example, cyber. Very difficult to recruit cyber people into the active duty workforce, given the other options that they might have. We know that cyber is a growing domain. The Army is strongly committed to expanding it. General Cardone thinks about this, every moment of his day. You can see the RC being a place where much of that capability resides, because people can be software engineers on the side while still serving in the California National Guard or the U.S. Army Reserve. That's just a way to access certain skills that we won't otherwise have. So that's what I would say, is that going forward, the RC is going to play a major role, just as they have in the past. And that in no way will we devalue their service or try to say in any way that they are not part of the total force and as valuable to us as all other components might be.
In the Marine Special Ops Army construct?
I don't know. I mean, you can see a major role for the reserve component in that, right? Working with already special forces reserve units, right, are out there in civil affairs and things like that. So, I mean, I think there is a role for them in that, because that's where, again, many of these key skills are going to reside for us, from languages to other things like that. So, I think there's a key role about that. Do you want to add more of your own thoughts about how they could be used in that?
I have some, but
Okay. Well, I said, okay.
We'll have the Ready Bois event next week.
All right.
So we have a question from Lieutenant Colonel Chuck Rush, who's a student at the Army War College.
Okay.
He says, for many of the conflicts that we found ourselves in, the traditional notion of victory and winning seems out of place. Do you believe we need to rethink our theory of victory for these conflicts that seemingly will be persistent and traditional notions of winning and victory may not really fit?
Well, perhaps it goes back to the portrait I mentioned. How many more Grant and Lees at Appomattox or USS Missouri treaty signings will we have in the future? That is the result of high-end, high-danger, kinetic conflict, of which I'm hopeful there will be less and less of going forward. One of the reasons there's less and less of it is because we are so damn good at it. That's one of the major things. It is true, and this is, I know many in this room would appreciate this, but you often hear out in the broader population, well, no one's going to take us on armor column in the future. And I say, yes, that's because our armor column always wins. And if we didn't have that armored column, right, they might choose to engage us in tank warfare. But they know if they choose to go that route, we would quickly prevail. I mean, that capability, even latent, is one you don't want to give up. So I hope we don't have high-end kinetic conflict. That is a good thing for the world, good thing for the U.S. Army. And those kind of peace treaties that result from it are iconic and historic for a reason. So do we have to redefine our sense of victory? I don't know what that means, really. I don't have a theory of victory, unless you mean it in this term, that victory is that the strategy has been successful. So the tools at my disposal have been closely linked in prosecuting successfully a political end, of which those don't often end these days with on the deck of a carrier and signing a treaty, but that the political goals have been achieved. That to me is a victory. It doesn't end again with, it ends with a SOFA agreement probably, right, or something like that. So no, I'm hopeful that we won't have too many more Appomattoxes, and I said, I won't lament their loss. And the reason we don't have more of them is because of things like the U.S. Army and the capabilities that the U.S. military has. It prevents those kind of things from happening in the first place. And that is a victory in and of itself.
Sir, hi, George Nicholson, a special operations consultant. Several weeks ago, the Secretary of the Army alluded to failures in the acquisition program in the Army. And as an example, I look back on what happened to the replacement for the OH-58 coming out of Vietnam. The original replacement the Army selected was the Cheyenne, built, flown by Lockheed, then canceled. And then the next program they looked was the Comanche by Sikorsky and Boeing, built, flown, canceled. The next one was the ARH, built by Bell, built, flown, and canceled. What's the Army learned from that, particularly now going down the path of looking at the future replacement of a Black Hawk, whether it's going to be the Defiant or whether it's going to be the Valor?
Well, you're kind to us. You could have mentioned some other programs in there that many of you in the media often report on, right? FCS, you talked about Comanche, there's the Crusader. We have a number of famous programs that when you list failed acquisition programs, the Army, despite spending far less on acquisition than other services, has a number that crowd their way to the top. So what have we learned? Well, my job is to make sure we learn the right lessons from it. And I think when you speak to people who thought deeply about acquisition, and we're trying to do more and more of that at the Department of Defense, where you have root cause analyses going on, and not looking at only our failures, but how the Zumwalt class gets to be so expensive, or how the F-35 has grown in cost, all these programs. One's much more obscure than either of those two. It comes down to your assumptions about things, right? About how the world works, assumptions that are so embedded in an organization that they are part of the mental furniture in a way, right? They're not even questioned or interrogated or decided upon. They just are the way the world works, in the same way that gravity is a force we feel, but don't really acknowledge on a moment-to-moment basis. So if you ask me what the major problem in Army acquisition has been, and this is true for the aviation programs, and it's something we're thinking about with future vertical lift, because we're cognizant of it, it comes back to what I said. One has to have a vision of future warfare. Who has to be on this bird? What's it going to be used for? What's its distance? What's it going to be doing? Is it going to be intra-theater lift? Is it going to be doing inter-theater travel? What's it going to be doing? What kind of army we're going to have? We're going to be garrison-based and try to get a division to you in a matter of weeks, and a BCT in hours. What are we going to be? Or is there a case, and you'll hear people occasionally make this, to say, what the Army does? We're about the row. We don't come fast, but we come right in spades, and we come off these boats, and when we come, we stay for years at a time, right, and show the full might of American power, right? There's a case for that. So the issue is what kind of Army are we going to be? And if you can't agree on that question, all these acquisition programs right, become questionable, because they are derivative of this larger vision about what kind of Army you want to have and what capabilities you need in it, which again come back from this idea of what future war is going to look like. So future vertical lift is something we think a lot about. We've gone to school on the F-35 lessons and what went well and what didn't go well there, these other acquisition programs. But it comes down to the assumptions about the assumptions about how programs operate and about how the world works that are really, they are at the genesis of all of these failures. And we have to be better about that. Mostly, again, by being smarter, being more intellectual, and being aware of the cognitive biases in any organization, but ones that are also in our organization and that lead us astray.
Can I ask a follow-on to that about Deputy Secretary Work issued a memo 3 or 4 weeks ago about wargaming and reinvigorating wargaming, and the Army has a long tradition of wargaming, and so I'm curious about the degree to which you feel that Army wargaming informs those kinds of considerations for you and for the other senior Army leaders, and Secretary Work's memo seemed to suggest that, and it was very broad, so I may be over-interpreting, but that set of activities across the enterprise was insufficient. So I'm interested about whether you have found it specifically to be so in the context of thinking about the future, thinking about different ways in which the Army might operate, and then any thoughts you have about how the Army's wargaming activities should evolve to better meet Secretary Work's intent.
Wargaming is a critical part of all that future planning I mentioned. The work that HR, Dave Perkins, are doing is informed by the wargaming they are doing as we speak. These warfighting concepts that are being developed, the centers of excellence in the Army where kind of the expertise in various areas lie, are deeply engaged in wargaming and trying to think through the future. Because that is the question that General Perkins and General McMaster are wrestling with. What's the future look like? Let's wargame it, let's think it through. What kind of doctrine do we need to have? What kind of material solutions need to exist? What kind of personnel system must go into this? So we are ourselves engaged in a renewed effort of wargaming. And wargaming has always been, as you said, a great part of the Army tradition. But I think you see in this Force 2025 and beyond, the Army operating concept, a renewed emphasis on its importance. And you're going to see a lot of it and a lot more of it. And people in this room will probably be quite involved with it. I think there's a general lament across Department of Defense that wargaming might have atrophied over the course of the last 15 years as we were engaged in this conflict, as opposed to thinking out long term, as the imperative was to meet the demands of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so did it atrophy? I don't know. I wasn't around for all of that. I think there is kind of a sense, a lot of evidence in support of it, that we could be doing better, or that skills that were once more easily found in the department are not so present anymore. And so I think he's right about doing that, because what Bob Work is doing, especially is what a bigger version of what we're thinking of here, right? The third offset strategy. What's the next step? What are the future threats? How do you deal with these things, not simply on a material basis, but across, as we like to say, the .mil PF, right? All aspects of military life. And wargaming has to be part of that. The Naval War College has some fascinating work about China and others that I am often privy to. So there's a great effort, I think, to reinvigorate a tradition. Whether it was a moribund tradition, I will let others decide. But I do know that going into the future, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on that.
Okay. Question, Ray?
Thanks, Maren. John Evans from Brookings, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an active Army colonel, and I'm one of the chief senior fellows. So I'd like to turn the conversation to people for just a minute, if we could. So I think we're all kind of aware, and certainly you are, that with regards to our accessions process, our recruiting process in particular, pretty easy to go to the heartland of America and recruit soldiers. Pretty easy to go to the Deep South and recruit soldiers. But what we are beginning to see, I think, is that on the peripheries, where we're seeing pretty significant demographic changes across our society, it's harder and harder to bring diversity into our ranks. Are we at risk 30, 40 years hence of becoming a Praetorian Guard for America that doesn't represent the diversity of our society because we're struggling with that aspect?
I'm being from Oklahoma, where we have a great tradition of service, and when you see the recruiting numbers from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, we pull a disproportionate weight in the enlisted ranks. Although I often point out that most of the senior leaders in the U.S. Army today are New Englanders, because we have the Vice from Maine, Perkins from New Hampshire, we have Milley from Boston, and McConville from Boston, and of course the Chief is from New York, and Grizzoli's from New York. It's all these Northerners leading us Southerners into battle. I don't wake up at night fearing a Praetorian Guard that will be somehow separate from the country. The Army, if any of the services get it right, we get it better than nearly all others do. But it is a recurring challenge to us that our recruiting is based in certain areas of the country. We don't do as well in, say, Southern California or South Florida as we should. Part of it is we don't put enough resources into those, perhaps, right? We should move there. We need to move our recruiting assets to track the demographic changes in this country. We have to have a better sales pitch. Fewer and fewer young men and women are even capable of serving, between obesity and criminal records. Fewer and fewer aspire to public service of any kind, including that in the military. And then the issue is for that small portion that want to be in the military, making them come to the U.S. Army. Why choose the Army as opposed to the Marine Corps or the Air Force or the Navy? That's the pitch we have to make, right? What are we selling to folks? And so we have to do a better job about that. So I don't worry about us creating a Praetorian Guard. It's something for us to be worried about. But if there's any institution in America that has been at the forefront of inclusiveness, of diversity, that's been a model, it's the U.S. Army. And it is still the place, and this is a remarkable feature of it, that attracts people who are first coming to this country or trying to get some toehold on the American dream. You think of the Army as a place to do that. More than any other service, I think. You think of like the Army. And it's an amazing thing. And I don't think we're in danger of losing that. But accessions is a really hard matter for us, just because of not the demographic changes, but maybe the psychographic changes, that the number of people who want to be in the U.S. military is not what it once was. And the people who can meet our exacting standards are fewer and fewer too. So we have to recognize how the challenge in front of us, but it's a little bit different challenge perhaps than the one that you raise. It's about encouraging people to be in the U.S. Army, especially because we do 60,000 a year now. Even in a time of downsizing, the friction in the Army is huge. People are coming in, coming out. And again, this year's recruiting goal is 60,000 young men and women. And no other service, right, has that kind of requirement. And it's a hard thing for us. General.
Mr. Secretary, Joe DeFrancisco from Leidos.
Of course.
I have a question about the recently released unfunded requirements list from the Army. Not so much what's on it, but what does it say about the cooperation between the Secretariat and the Army staff, between the AC and the RC, between Department of the Army and Department of Defense? And lastly, does it have any real meaning, or is it something that Congress wants to just put a mark on the wall with?
I think it has real meaning, to start with your last question first. It has real meaning in the sense of it shows you where a Army that is stretched thin would like to put more money, where we've taken risk, and where we would like to mitigate that risk in the program. So I think it does have meaning in that sense. It's interesting, and it's an important exercise for us. I don't perhaps accept the premise of the question that there is some kind of underlying friction embodied in it, in that I was involved with it, saw it a lot, worked with DOD about it, and it was a fairly seamless task between the AC and the RC, within the R staff and the Secretariat, about the UFOR list. Congress likes it, of course, to engage in their own battles, of which I used to participate. But I don't know that the UFOR list has within it some controversy. I mean, it was, we were very good at these kind of things. If the Army is any good at anything, right, it's UFOR lists, one-to-end lists, these kind of matters, right, we use them. So it was part of that drill, and I think it worked fairly smoothly, with most people being, I think, satisfied with the result of it, including DOD thinking that we had answered their expectation of us.
Okay. Last question. If not, I'll take one from the web. Okay.
Sir.
Sir, Sergeant Major Cantrell. I'm an active duty sergeant major in a defense fellowship program. I would just like your perspective, what the Army faces should we face another sequestration. What are your greatest concerns?
Well, the greatest concerns are we have a $6 or $7 billion hit that we're going to take in the upcoming fiscal year, right off the bat. And where does that money come from? Because, right, many of our costs are rather sticky. We are downsizing rapidly from 570 to perhaps 450,000 before this is all over. Some even suggest lower than that. But that is a sticky cost. We can't just shed costs overnight in the matter of weeks. And there's only so much we can do each year. More than 20,000 creates unacceptable readiness challenges for us. Our modernization accounts have already been, as I mentioned at the outset, cut to the bone, to historic lows. And those are always the leading indicators of both budget downturns and upticks, because the money can be easily taken from there. So, right, one has to worry about the readiness of the U.S. Army. And that is what we produce in the end, right? If you think of what the business of the U.S. Army is, it's ready, sustainable combat units. And so that $7 billion will affect readiness in a profound way. And that's not good for the country. It will also lead invariably to the already skeletal modernization programs being extended, to multi-year contracts being broken, to these debates being pushed out into the future about how we're going to think of various systems and how we're going to replace it. I mean, all of these kind of things get pushed out and postponed, cut on the margins. At $7 billion for just this coming year, that's a big hit to us. Again, especially since we are down from what we expected a few years ago. But the operations and maintenance accounts are where it's easy to find money, and so readiness will be right, the immediate casualty of sequestration. Thank you, Sergeant Major, for your service as well.
Sure. thank you for taking the time to come talk with us today. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for making the time as well. You're welcome back anytime.
Well,
You
thank you,
come
Maren.
back tomorrow.
Thank you all for letting me come by. I enjoyed it very much. So
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Maren.
Really
Appreciate
appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Enjoy your time.